Welcome back, everyone. I hope you are all staying safe and healthy out there. This week, we are doing a little bit of catch up. I'm briefly going to go over realism and then we're going to jump right into Impressionism for week 11. And then next week, you'll do an activity probably with Impressionism and also Post Impressionism. And that's how we will finish off our second unit. Now, I wanted to start off by talking about the term realism because it's very similar to romanticism, where we think we know the definition, but it's really talking about different things. And so here I have realism versus realistic because these are two different things. So, things to remember. Realism with a lowercase r is easy to spot. That just means, is the painting or the sculpture realistic? Does it look like it belongs in the real world? Realism with a capital R is harder to spot because realism with a capital R is an art movement that is very specific to the 19th century. And so what we're going to see is a painting, say a neoclassical painting, can be realistic, but it is not part of the realism movement. So realism is not the same as realistic. So always watch out. Most art movements are capitalized. So if you see realism with a capital R, it's talking about the art movement, not how realistic the artwork is. Because you can see in this piece by Tanner, it's not as hyper realistic as the neoclassical, but it's very much a painting from the realism movement, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So realism with that capital R spans from around 1840 to around 1865, and it represents the everyday. So again, this is rather similar to what we saw in the Baroque movement, where we saw taverns and everyday people being represented by Velázquez. Here, we see something very similar, representations of workers, domestic everyday life, and landscapes. Subjects that would before not have been considered appropriate for depiction in something like a painting. So here we have a banjo lesson, and this is an African American gentleman teaching this young boy how to play the banjo. They are obviously not wealthy people, you can see from the background. And this was not something that painters were clamoring to depict before this. This is not romantic in any way. Remember, romanticism is about that nostalgia, while realism is about looking at the here and now. And I'll talk more about this in our third unit, but usually artists who are just like us, right? Regular people, we have two ways of looking at a situation. You have people that fall into kind of the more romantic aspect of longing for a distant or not so distant past, and you have people that kind of buckle in and want to really look at things as they are. And I think where we are in our own crisis right now, you can kind of identify where you find yourself. And those are two ways of dealing with your current reality. Right? So going back to realism here. At realism is usually naturalistic, meaning it usually looks pretty realistic. So it's not going to be abstract. And we're going to talk all about abstraction in our next unit. But it's still depicting the real world in a pretty naturalistic way. Now, we're going to see kind of a shift for the artist. So remember how the artist used to be devoted to painting pictures of the royal family, of religious scenes, where those kind of things are changing and the role of the artist in society is changing. So no longer is it important to simply paint what is beautiful. And we saw that break with Goya, where he's no longer just painting things that are beautiful, but he's painting things as they are. They artists of the realism movement aimed to tell the truth, while the romantics tried to, emulate a very distant romanticized past. These artists want to focus on the plight of individuals right now. And here we have the Stonebreaker. So this is a French piece, and you have workers who before this would not have been painted, and one of the goals of realism was to paint them as they are, so not to romanticize them. And this is done to different levels of accuracy, because there's always a little bit of sentimentality in some of these paintings, some more than others, as we'll see. This is Millet's The Gleaners. This is an incredibly famous piece. This is realism with that capital R. You see the Gleaners, and the Gleaners would have been usually women that would come in after the harvest and just kind of pick up any stray pieces. So this is the poorest of the poor. And you can see from their clothes, they're not dressed lavishly. They are not, I mean, they don't look like the individuals that we've seen before in paintings. Now, I wanted to shift because those two images are coming from France, and most of your reading was really focused in on France when it came to realism. And I want to shift over to Russia because these are two very different ways of depicting images in this realism movement. Right? While in the French scene, yes, these women are obviously poor, and you know that they are in plight. You know kind of what conditions they're living in. It's still very calm, right? You don't see their faces, you don't see their anguish. Not like here. And I'm gonna have you watch a video, I think, on this piece, perhaps, maybe. This is Ilya Repin's Barge Haulers on the Volga. And this really touches on the plight of the Russian people during this time. Now, we're going to be coming back to Russia because they are a huge player when it comes to modern art. But what we're seeing here is social commentary. And that's what all of these artists that are part of this realism movement are about. They are commenting and they are bringing attention to the plight of the very poorest of society. And of course, in Russia, you still had a system where these people were living in serfdom. They were living almost as indentured slaves. And you can see where they are using these men to haul that barge, so that boat in the back, onto land. And what you'll see with this painting is that this is in the 19th century. There is already steamboat technology, and that's being depicted over here in the corner. So there is the technology to bring the ship onto land using steamboats. But human labor is still cheap enough, and there's this complete disregard for the humanity of these peasants that they're still using them for this purpose. So this is another type of message that realist painters wanted to invoke: the plight of the poor. And this is actually one of Russia's most famous paintings. It was used for propaganda purposes by later rulers of Russia, but it really touches on the situation that people in Russia were going through. So it's not kings and queens and Napoleon on a throne. It is the poorest people and the people that made up the largest population of Russia and what their 19th century looked like. And I want to mention this because when we talk about the Impressionists, I want to mention that what the Impressionists are painting is their reality, but their reality is very different in the 19th century than the reality of these peasants. Right? Now, let's That's a good segue into Impressionism. So, Impressionism starts in France in the late 19th century. So, that is not very far off from when Europeans painting was done in Russia. So, again, remember, even though we're talking about just Europe and the Americas in this situation, there are vastly different experiences of one time period. I mean, an easy way of talking about this, which is closer to home, is when we think about the 1950s, right? A lot of us have nostalgia for the 1950s, this time where everything was much better, right? Except if you were a woman or a person of color, or basically anybody that was not white, right? Your experience of the 1950s would have been much different. So you're going to see very different experiences and different representations when it comes to art of the 19th century. So back to Impressionism. So what we're going to see in Impressionism is a shared set of approaches and techniques. And we don't often think of Impressionism as being radical, revolutionary, or technical, but it is all of these things. So it is focused on an interest of natural color and the effects of light and color. And we started seeing this with the pre-Raphaelites. Their interest in the natural world, where here it's going to be more of an interest in the optics, in the way that light reflects off of surfaces. And the term was comes to us from Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, which was the very first slide I think I showed you, or maybe I didn't show it to you, but it is in your textbook. And this was a criticism, like most names for art movements in art history. It was a critique of Monet's painting because the critic came up to it and said, it looks undone, it looks unfinished, it's like an impression. And the name stuck because it really is an impression of a moment in time. That is what the Impressionists are trying to capture. Now, notice I said it starts in France, and that really gives it its shape and its tone. It would have been very different had it started in Russia. Russia was not at all concerned in painting lavish garden parties or water lilies. It was more looking at the realistic landscape of Russia and the real plight of the poor. Now, this, of course, is incredibly different than the barge haulers painting, right? This is Renoir's Moulin de la Galette. And the Moulin de la Galette was kind of this big outdoor party. And so what you're seeing here is Paris in the 19th century. It was an exciting time to be alive, especially if you were a young man, a young artist. Social norms were starting to change. Of course, not necessarily for women, right? I'm going to have you watch a video about the women impressionists because there were several very important women who played a part in Impressionism. But their world was very different. During this time, you would call kind of a man about town a flaneur. This was a man that went to cafes and went to this is basically your 19th century French hipster, right? They're at outdoor cafes and they're at the latest parties and they are kind of painting the landscape. They're going out to the countryside. So they are participating in all of these activities that are very much part of 19th century French society, right? They are kind of taking advantage of all of the advances of the Industrial Revolution as well. But women didn't have the ability to go to cafes or to go out to the countryside by themselves to paint or to go to many of these parties if they were respectable women. And so what we're going to see is that the paintings of the female impressionists tend to be those of their children, indoor scenes, garden scenes, the world that made up their lives. So again, that focus on people in the late 19th century are painting their world, but it's a very different world depending on who you are. All right. So this is at the dance class. So of course the focus on movement, on light, dancers. They also are going to have a love for water. So they're going to go out, and again, because water glitters when the light hits it. And so they're very much interested in that phenomena and capturing that in oil paint. So you can see that here in this painting. And what we're going to see is, in terms of technique, there's going to be several advances. So now oil paints are going to come in tubes. And this is revolutionary because before this, you had to wrap your oil paint in like a pig splatter in order to be able to take it outdoors. Now it comes in paint, and the brushes have a new notch on them that makes them flat. And so these technical advances make it possible for these artists to go out into the countryside on new steamboat technology because of the Industrial Revolution and paint these kind of countryside scenes or these party scenes in town. This is another piece. And you can see they look almost blurry. And to our modern eyes, they don't seem particularly revolutionary or dramatic. In fact, you usually find impressionist paintings in like courthouses or in doctor's office. They're very non-confrontational today, right? But they were incredibly dramatic and kind of off-putting to people when they first came out, because people were saying like that's kind of like an unfinished canvas. And it would be the equivalent of how, you feel when you look at one of those canvases that only has like drips of paint on it, and you're like, what is that? Right? That's basically how people felt in the 19th century about impressionism. All right. And I brought this one in to sort of compare. Now, this is a French realistic painting, realism with a capital R here. The Third Class Carriage. And notice it's from 1862-64, right? And here we have Renoir's Moulin de la Galette from 1876. So not a lot of time has passed. It's only been about 10 years. And you can see the drastic differences, right? Where these painters that were kind of living the Moulin Rouge life. So if you've ever seen the Moulin Rouge, this is kind of that time period. Yes, they were often poor. They were often kind of living in this neighborhood that kind of was kind of the Las Vegas kind of anything goes sort of neighborhood. But they were not living the life that we see in this painting on the left, where we see families, right, that are in a third class carriage. So, what did this world look like? It was very different than this kind of 19th century hipster lifestyle. All right, so let me continue here. Oh, okay. So the next slide I have talks a little bit more about a very important influence on Impressionism, and that is ukiyo-e. Ukiyo-e comes from Japan, and the term means pictures of the floating or passing world, and it has to do with Buddhism, an idea in Buddhism which we don't have the time to get into right now, but it talks about the transience of life. And if you remember, the idea that the Impressionists are trying to capture a moment in time very much aligns with the idea of ukiyo-e. And now it is a type of genre, so it's very similar to, say, painting or like impressionist painting or romantic painting. So it's a type of painting, and it is usually done in woodblock prints and paintings, and it spans from around the 17th to 19th century. So they are contemporaneous, although the Impressionists are going to be inspired by ukiyo-e prints that are a little bit older than the 19th century. Now, these prints are going to show the modern and fashionable world, which again is very similar to what the French Impressionists are going to be doing. And you can see that in this print here. So in this print here, we actually see a scene of two kabuki actors. And if you've ever wondered where does manga come from, if you enjoy manga, reading manga, it comes from these ukiyo-e prints. So these prints were originally meant to be kind of pop culture. It's the Instagram of 7th to 19th century Japan. This is where you would depict the latest geishas or the most popular actors, and they would have kind of the coolest outfits and hairstyles, and then everybody would go and copy them. So this is capturing modern life in Japan. So I know it looks very historic to us, but this would have been like a movie poster, as it were. Right? And it was started by a growing middle class that wanted to have art, but perhaps could not commission a large scale painting. They could buy a print, though, that was very cheap. And so these prints eventually make it to the West. And the painters and sculptors in Europe were absolutely captivated by this Japanese style. And part of that is they had never seen anything like this. So in the East, you don't have the type of linear perspective that you had developed in the West with um, during the Renaissance. So instead, you have an isometric perspective. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but it's almost like you're looking down at a piece, and there's always in these prints, because of the way that they're printed, that you have these flat surfaces of color, and everything's kind of flattened into a 2D picture plane. And that was incredibly revolutionary to these artists in the 19th century. And so they are absolutely captivated. And so what you see again, as similar with Romanticism, is some exoticizing of Japan. So they are absolutely obsessed with everything Japanese, but they don't particularly care to understand the culture. They just kind of want to appropriate it, as it were. And so you can see here is a Whistler painting, and this woman is obviously wearing a kimono. You have a Japanese screen in the back, and she is looking at Japanese prints. Here we have another piece. I believe it's also by Whistler. Yes. And again, this Western woman in a Japanese gown, kimono, and it's a very similar scene to this print. Another artist that is going to love Japanese prints is Vincent van Gogh. Now, Van Gogh is going to be a post-impressionist, really, and there's kind of a fine line between the impressionist and the post-impressionist, and I'll talk a little bit about their differences at the end here. But he is absolutely going to be captivated by them, and you can see in this portrait that he does, all the entire background is made up of Japanese prints. Here we have another piece, and this one just shows you the clear way in which these Japanese artists were influencing Western artists. So here we have Plum Tree. So this is from Hiroshige, and then the Van Gogh copy. So obviously, the Impressionists are going to be using oil paint. They're going to have kind of a different technique, but the composition is almost completely exactly the same. So they're also going to take inspiration from compositions and the way the models pose, as we can see in this piece. And this one, which is not a great quality, unfortunately, but you can see here the composition is the same, right? This bridge over water. Now, the scene is very different because the Japanese landscape is just very different than the French landscape. But you can see the inspiration here. Now, I wanted to mention a little bit about the post-impressionists. So post-impressionism really takes off about 1885, and these artists are not going to share a similar style. What they're going to share is an interest in the properties of line, pattern, form, and color. So in this way, they're not that different from the Impressionists that are very technical. So all of these are formal qualities of art. So if you've taken Art History 1, you kind of know what those are. But it's very technical. So they're going to be really interested in the technical aspects of art. They're going to focus on form and composition, but they're going to be more involved. So it's not just about capturing a moment in the countryside. It's about personal expression and spiritual content. And here again comes that spiritual content. All right. So these are more personal, as it were. And whenever you look at a Van Gogh, you can't help but realize that his paintings are intimately personal, right? You see his entire mind and his entire soul in his paintings. And that's not really impressionistic, that's post impressionistic. And then here we have perhaps one of the most famous pieces to come out of post impressionism, and that is the Scream. I feel like this is how a lot of us are feeling right now. And we can empathize with it, though. And one time I had an art student ask me, why is this piece so famous? Well, it's so famous because there's something just incredibly emotional about it's pulling at your humanity, because we have all at one point felt like this individual. And I think it's incredibly powerful because it's being abstracted. And this is what we're going to notice in post impressionism is things start getting much more abstracted than in impressionism. So we are obviously on a boardwalk, there's the ocean and the sky, but it's all made up of swirling colors, and it's almost like you're in a dream or perhaps a nightmare. And the figure, it has been completely abstracted into this almost ghostly shape. When you look at it could be anybody, right? It's kind of this, the soul of humanity in this particular moment having an existential crisis. And so that's really what post impressionism is about. It's about bearing your soul, it's about exploring spirituality and the greater a greater emotional input, because this is very different than, say, let me go back, than this in terms of feel. While these are very calm, post impressionist paintings tend to kind of pull at your heartstrings a little bit more. Now, this is where I am going to kind of wrap up. I have a couple more documentary videos for you to watch. And so go ahead and once you finish discussing under this lecture, you can move on to those. And I will see you next week with more information.